I really need to get like a dedicated microphone or something because oh hello, my dog's staring at me. Are you gonna cause issues? Oh no, you're fine, she's lying down, that's okay. So we are back. After my last video I told you to go out and buy the starter set, so let's say that you did. Fantastic, support your friendly local game store. You've gone out, you've bought the starter set, you've read through the starter set rulebook, you've looked through the adventure, and you've thought, I'm gonna run this for my friends, which you should, it's a lot of fun. But after doing so, maybe you've talked to your friends, or I guess in these COVID times it's a bit of a hypothetical. Let's say you've gotten your friends together and you're all sitting at the table and you've handed out the pre-generated character sheets, and your players are receptive, they pick and choose, you might explain some of the classic archetypes that come with the starter set characters, but maybe one of them isn't too keen, or they have an idea and they say, oh, I was looking forward to playing so-and-so character. So when that happens, what are you going to do? You see, a lot of people sort of bring this generic fantasy land sort of ideas to something like D&D. It's that sort of setting, that Tolkien-esque sort of thing where all the elves sound proper and British and all the orcs are evil and they always sound cockney, something like that. And that's fine. A lot of games run in that way. I mean, when I first started, that's exactly what I did, really playing to those classic fantasy cliches. If you have a player that doesn't really have a great deep connection to those sort of cliches or that sort of those ideas about the fantasy genre of things, then what can you do? So I've found that in my experience, when you have a player like this, what you really need to do is you need to look at your own connection to Fantasyland and sort of look at those classic fantasy archetypes and really try and think creatively in how you can apply these archetypes to other things, maybe in other movies or TV shows, which can be a really great source of inspiration for coming up with a character. So let's look at the pre-generated characters. I'm gonna step over slightly and we should, if my editing skills are good, boom, they should be appearing somewhere along here. So we have 5 pre-generated characters that come with the starter set. We have the Dwarven Cleric, we have the Human Fighter, we have the Elf Ranger, we have the High Elf Wizard, and finally we have the Halfling Rogue. These are some very classic, very typical fantasy and D&D pairings. I'm going to look at these a little more closely. Almost all of these character archetypes you can see in Lord of the Rings, the quintessential example of high fantasy, or I guess it's low magic fantasy in D&D. We have our halfling rogues, which are all of the hobbits, of course, very sneaky. Even in The Hobbit, we have Bilbo Baggins, who plays a thief. We have the human fighter seen in Boromir and Aragon, although Aragon is close to being a ranger as well. We have the elf ranger, who is of course Legolas, everyone's favorite archer. The elf wizard is of course Elrond, and just generally the elves in Rivendell and in Tolkien's setting sort of more broadly. And then finally the dwarf cleric is one that is rather deeply rooted in sort of fantasy land and in D&D in general. There isn't really a cleric. There are dwarves, mind you, but none that have magic and typically healing powers. Of course, if you have a connection to Fantasyland, you've probably read or seen The Lord of the Rings. So if we're dealing with a player that doesn't really have much of a connection, and you might be watching this video right now, you might be thinking, well, Seb, I don't know, you're throwing all these proper nouns and people at me and I have no frame of reference. So let's look at the archetypes themselves, these sort of classes, the rogue, the fighter, etc. And let's look at how we could apply those a little more broadly to some other movies or TV shows. So rogues generally deal with sneaking around, being stealthy and stealing things. So you could easily think of, say, a secret agent or a burglar in a heist movie. Some people that come to mind immediately are Ethan Hunt from the Mission Impossible movies, James Bond in every one of his movies, or even Ant-Man from the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of these characters are pretty stealthy, they can hold themselves for the most part in combat, and they are pretty skilled. They have a lot of skills in a lot of different areas which rogues really excel in. Wizards are generally thought to be highly intelligent academic scholars who have to learn how to practice and use magic through rigorous and lengthy study. Just thinking about wizards and study, I'm thinking Harry Potter. I'm thinking Hermione Granger in particular, who is incredibly intelligent, incredibly studious, and has a fantastic control and just general magic ability. Fighters are pretty easy to think of. They fight, they do fantastically in combat, whether it's with a sword and a shield, with a warhammer, or with a bow. When I'm thinking of a fighter, I'm thinking of someone like Captain America or Achilles from Troy, or the Spartans in 300. Really just any sort of action movie hero, you can pretty easily say they're a fighter. With some exceptions, I still think that John McClane is a rogue and no one is going to be able to convince me otherwise. Playing a ranger typically means you're going to be using a bow and augmenting that with a little bit of spell casting. You could think of that as, say, Hawkeye, although you could reflavor his magic spells as his different types of arrows and equipment that he has. Or you could think of someone like Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, who has to use her archery and sort of her survival skills, tracking and everything in order to survive the Hunger Games themselves. As for clerics, they are, again, as I said, one of the more difficult classes to think of a sort of modern character. I'm sure something like priest, or really any priest from like a horror movie, from The Exorcist or something, could be a good base for a cleric character. Although, now that I think about it, just generally playing a preacher who can call down God's wrath whenever he wants is pretty cool. I don't think you need it. You need a pop culture character in order to sell you one playing one. All of these characters are fantastic sources of inspiration to help you start thinking about the kind of character that you might want to build and play. Do note that I say inspiration. You should not try and 100% replicate a character from pop culture. You could try and build Batman, but you would need quite a few different classes to mix into, quite a few levels as well, and some pretty ridiculous stats in order to try and replicate exactly what Batman is like. You could create a character similar. I did have a character in one of my campaigns named Angelo de Terra, who was a mix between a rogue and a monk, and he was so cool. He was so complicated, but he had all of these crazy abilities that basically made him like Batman. It was sweet. Of course, I've just mentioned a handful of movies. There are so many movies out there, so many of which that we all know and love would be almost perfect to take direct inspiration from for a D&D character or even a D&D adventure. The Road for El Dorado is a classic example of what happens when you get a bard and a rogue going to a mysterious land on a side quest, or something like Treasure Planet, that sci-fi retelling of Treasure Island, is basically about a group of rogue swashbucklers and fighters going around in a 2nd edition D&D Spelljammer in the Astral Sea. That is so cool, and it's also one of my favorite settings. I'll do another video on it at some point in time. It's super sweet. You don't just need to look at movies, you can look at TV shows as well. Something like Avatar: The Last Airbender is basically all about monks, or even Stranger Things, which is pretty much a D&D show at its heart, features several characters that have different magic powers, such as Eleven, who is pretty much a sorcerer, or Game of Thrones, which is just filled with fantasy cliches. There are plenty of places that you can get great inspiration from for making your next D&D character. So that's it, folks. That's the video. Talk with your players, see what they want to play. They might have an idea from a TV show or a movie character, or they might just have something as simple as, I want to hit things with a sword, or I want to be able to shoot fire magic. That's fantastic. Just work with your players, see what it is that they want to play to make sure that they are having the most fun in your game. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm having a lot of fun making these videos and talking about one of my favorite hobbies. I'm going to be doing a video, probably the next one, which will be looking at the character sheets and all the numbers and what's going on there. If there's anything that you would like to see, please drop a comment down below there. You know what to do. I don't need to tell you guys this. You can do all the usual YouTube stuff, share this around, and I'll see you guys some other time.